Hello and welcome to Into the Abyss podcast. My name is Todd Decker. I'm here with Mike, and today we're going to be talking about the Book of Mormon. And I had Mike on a few months ago, and we were talking about the Bible, and I really enjoyed that discussion. And afterwards, I thought, we really need to talk about the Book of Mormon because we're both Latter-day Saints, and Book of Mormon's part of our scripture. And I know Mike especially is has studied the Book of Mormon a lot and is very knowledgeable on it. So I thought it would be an excellent topic to get into. So Mike, thank you for coming back and prepping for this.
No problem.
So we've both done some reading, some secondary reading. I was actually thinking, should I read the whole Book of Mormon again all the way through to get ready for this? And as I was,
that's a little overkill.
That would be, I thought, what's the primary source, right? I mean, that would be, but then as I was kind of evaluating that and seeing what that would entail, I realized the Book of Mormon is very long. It's a big book.
It's like the 100. It's 25% larger than the New Testament, roughly.
Oh, okay. Yep.
So.
Yep. Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, I guess I hadn't always appreciate that, but it really dawned on me when I was deciding whether or not to go about and do that. I mean, I still think I should go back and read the whole thing sometime soon, but it is definitely not a minor piece of work. So is one way to put it. It's substantial. As a text, as a document.
Yes.
So
very multifaceted, and a lot of a common theme that people Latter-day Saints have talked about is, doing a read of the Book of Mormon, focusing on just one thing or just one angle, and seeing it show many examples of that.
Mm-hmm. And
then reading it for a completely different reason and having a completely different experience. And I think, I'm very, I find myself very willing to criticize LDS people for being lenient on themselves and not willing to look at like what they look like to outsiders. But for that, I don't think that applies to that idea.
To the
fact that the book, or just the opinion that the Book of Mormon has so many different ways that it can be used, and that it is interesting. I fully agree with that. I think it deserves to be part of world scripture canon easily.
Yeah.
I've read the Gita, I've read the Upanishads, I've read translation, obviously, the Ramayana, the Quran, the Bible, of course. What else do I got up here? The Popol Vuh, if I'm saying that right.
Oh, nice.
I think you've read that one too. And then I had the Gnostic Bible, which I love. And I think I've read some other ones that the Urantia book, though I don't think I'm ever going to read that, but I have a copy of it, and some other stuff. But yeah, I just think it's a great book, and I got a chip on my shoulder for it, like any other Latter-day Saint does. I think it's anyone who dismisses it without reading it, it's like, well, I don't take you seriously. You don't know what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. I think you've mentioned before that you consider it personally one of the most impactful or influential books for you. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yes, it is. It has started to decrease in rank lately, but I would say like the first, it's still in my top 3, and first 30 years of my life, favorite book. And it will always be a favorite of mine.
It's definitely going to be remain up there. Yeah. Well, excellent.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's interesting. I like your how you mentioned the list of other world religious texts, and that it's not that it's the only book you've read. That even in the context of all these others, you see it as holding its own and deserving a place in that.
Yes.
It's interesting too that somebody that we're going to talk about on his Book of Mormon scholarships, Grant Hardy. Um, a lot of LDS listeners may know him primarily through his Book of Mormon work, but outside of that, people probably would know Grant Hardy the best for his work in Eastern
Asian
studies, religious studies, religious texts. He's a lecturer on the Great Courses, and he does excellent work there. And interestingly enough, one of his courses on the Great Courses is Sacred Texts, and I think it's 36 lectures where he'll devote a few lectures to Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism. Buddhism has a lot because there are many, many texts in Buddhism. Christianity, of course, and get into, of course, the canonical texts, and then also Gnostic texts and things like that. But he also has a lecture on Latter-day Saint texts, which, it's fair to ask, okay, if he weren't LDS, would that have made it in there? But regardless, I think that he made a fair judgment that it deserved a place in there, at least one lecture out of the 36. And he talked about the Book of Mormon, of course, in that lecture, as well as Doctrine and Covenants, Prologate Price, and a little bit about the temple ceremonies as well, and the different religious texts that we have in our religion. And it was interesting hearing that placed in the context and some of the comparisons that he made in the way that it fits into the Latter-day Saint religion, and as other texts fit into theirs. And so anyway, if anybody's interested, I would highly recommend the whole course, but also his treatment in that half-hour lecture. And then, of course, all the stuff that we're going to talk about today of his scholarship, because he's done a lot. And I understand you've done a lot of study and writing as well over the years on the Book of Mormon, correct?
Yes. For today's session, I did reread Understanding the Book of Mormon, the article you posted that was a little bit critical of that book. And I have somewhere in a dusty digital corner, I have about 25,000 words written, highly influenced by Hardy. And for me, anyone who wants to say that Hardy is, like too speculative, you can't make a case about, the Book of Mormon being about flawed people, and that's the wrong thing to focus on, and you're speculating too much, blah, 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 blah. There's so much more of that in there. I also read, not because you asked me to, but because I instantly got it, Michael Austin's Buried Treasures, which is not a favorite, but it did have some new stuff in it that I liked. And he mentions that a couple times that he read Hardy, and I can tell that influenced him too. And that gave me some even more ideas. There's a lot to it. I don't know. I don't know if there were a lot of different things you want to talk about, but I didn't know. Well, and I know, and there's other parts of the Understanding the Book of Mormon too. I just think the most famous part is the first section about critiquing Nephi and how he is a guy who feels regret and doubts his own choices and actions, and who as being very disingenuous about his retelling
Mhm.
of his youth.
Well, yeah, let me let's do get into that. I think that'd be a good place to start. Um, and I'll just preface it by saying in a previous episode, like way back, well, old in the length in terms of this podcast, about a year ago, I was having a conversation, and I think I mentioned off the cuff the a comment that I heard from Thomas Waymont, who recently did a translation of the New Testament that is with the footnotes and everything in it is directed toward Latter-day Saints, but kind of similar to a I would say kind of a Revised Standard Version type translation. So a little easier to follow than King James language. But anyway, he compared some impressions that he had of Paul to Nephi, and one of the things I mentioned was that Nephi in the Book of Mormon seems so perfect in comparison to Paul, who's very self-critical and definitely has his flaws right there up front. Some that he doesn't even seem sorry for, but others that he does. And you challenge that idea that Nephi seems too good to be true or too perfect, but that he has actually a much more I guess you could say, depending on how you want to look at it, either a more interesting character or a more troubled or not as perfect character as we might think sometimes. Um, and so anyway, I think that would be a good thing to follow up on with Nephi. So you can comment on that or just delve right into what we see of Nephi as a narrator in the beginning.
So so it sounds like you're on the same page with me. Are there any parts of it that you disagree with, or regarding Hardy specifically, that you disagree with, or that you doubt? Or because most of what he says, especially the more significant parts, I pretty much agree with. There's a couple parts I could nitpick at, like Hardy says that he's being manipulative when he's telling about when they were on the boat, and I was like, that's a little overreaching. Or not including Lehi as one of the three witnesses of Jesus was a diss against Lehi. I don't think that was on Nephi's mind, but those are very minor points to me.
Yeah.
The relationship between him and Lehi and him and Laman and Lemuel, the overall take that Hardy has, I very much agree with. And I think something that really seals the deal on that is Jacob, which I think we could talk about. But before we get to that, I just wanted to say, do you what's your take? Like, where are you at? What you know?
A little bit, I guess. I find Hardy's interpretation in Nephi compelling and interesting, and I guess persuasive as well. I don't feel much of a need to come down one way or another on
You're agnostic on it. Sure.
A little bit, yeah. I guess, and this is something I want to talk either now or at some point about is the place of all these different types of interpretations.
So I think the most valid and common concern is, what is the point? How is this enriching our faith? Kind of thing, right?
Right.
And to me, the money verse about the Book of Mormon, because I think I said last time we talked, I think I've said on this podcast before, that the Book of Mormon is a book about what not to do. You know, if you want to look, I once had we visited some people in our old ward a couple of years ago that had a boy that was the age of one of our boys, and they were good friends, and we happened to be up there, and so we visited them for a couple hours, and the wife, and this was an unusual thing, so please don't read too much into this, because this does not usually happen to me, but she's like, she really wanted to talk to me about a talk she was giving and pick my brain. And she said, well, you know the Book of Mormon really well, and the thing is like I think she kind of struggled with depression. She's like, I'm trying to be more optimistic in my life, and I would keep reading the Book of Mormon, and it's a good book, and I have a testimony of it, but it wasn't really doing it for me. And I said, the Book of Mormon is not a book you should be reading if you're depressed. You should read the New Testament if you want to feel happy about something, because the Book of Mormon is very, very sad. It is a tragedy, and the whole book is about what not to do, and it has bright spots and uplifting and moments of hope, but it's not. I don't think that's its job. I think if you want to be optimistic and build yourself up and not be depressed, you should read the New Testament. And there's nothing wrong with that, because the Book of Mormon says that it's there to get you to read the Bible.
Right.
So a lot of people, a Bible, everyone focuses on the fact that the Book of Mormon is defending itself, and it's like, it's not really something that I think that has been analyzed a lot or in depth, or if it is, it's at a shallow level. But the Book of Mormon really is a great compliment, and it's not just because they directly reference each other, or because it quotes the Bible a lot, or because of the way that the Isaiah chapters are slightly different, and so that's an homage. I just mean, like, they really fill each other's gaps. Like anything in the Book of Mormon, you're like, gee, I wish it had this. The Bible has already covered. It does a great job of adding, of assisting to the Bible. And I realize that people, there's a lot of critics who'll be like, 15, I can't remember the percentage, 20% is, Bible repaste. It's like, okay, well, that's still a lot of material that isn't
right.
that. and it's still, it covers a lot of stuff. And it's not just, the old baptism of little children, like obvious, that's low hanging fruit.
Mm-hmm.
I just mean, like big picture, where do we go from here? Type stuff.
I like the compliment that you talked about, how it's not just that there's an idea that's missing from the Bible and the Book of Mormon fills it in, but that thematically it kind of leads to the Bible and fits into it. And something I thought about is so Adam Miller wrote a book on Ecclesiastes, which is, he kind of sees as about hopelessness. And he said it kind of complements his other book on Romans, which is about faith, right? And that before you have faith, you have to have hopelessness, and abandon this idea of you seeing that everything's going to work out okay. You kind of have to see the problems and have the despair first, and then you find the faith.
That conference talk, but if not, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too. I was thinking of I think it was Ezra Taft Benson who gave me this idea that the Book of Mormon is kind of a tragedy by genre, because he talks about it as a book of a fallen people.
Yes.
So and it seems tragic, like epic tragedy, right?
It's an epic tragedy, and Nephi and Hardy hints that Nephi causes his own people's downfall, but it's not explained why. But the whole book as a whole explains how it gets there, and it would take me a very long time to go through that. So I don't. I can touch on a couple parts to it, but the thing is there's the Bible, the New Testament teaches us of Christ, and it has the core things that you need for Christianity. But there needs to be, but one thing that one of my favorite parts of the New Testament is the Book of Acts. And there's just not enough Book of Acts in it. You know what I mean? And so it's like you have the Gospels and you have Paul, and that's pretty much almost all of it. There's Hebrews, there's Acts, there's Revelation, but there's little, like 80-90% of it is those two things. And it's not a good baseline of stories, heritage, and church workings to prevent people from arguing with each other. And then what does the Book of Mormon do? It says, well, here's a bunch of different things people argued about. And then Jesus comes and says, spirit of contention is of the devil. And that's, I mean, you can make an argument for it in the New Testament, but I think the Book of Mormon makes that point much better.
So is it in the Book of Acts, you like seeing, is it that kind of
like life after
daily
Jesus,
life of
life after Jesus, it's like because once he goes back to heaven, we still got to live. And then what do we do? And I don't, and Paul's great, but like, he doesn't, in his own right, even his own writings by admission aren't there to tell us, what to do. They give us an idea because they're so intimate, and it's him instructing some other people. But it doesn't. It's not modern revelation. It's extremely detailed personal revelation to specific groups of people.
Oh, I see.
In a short time window, and it's amazing. But like, you can't have that as your core baseline. Yet, pretty much all Protestantism, it's Paul. And the Gospels are amazing, but they're not really. They're just kind of, I don't know. I feel like the Gospels are given lip service, and the people who quote the Gospels the most are people who are not religious.
Yeah,
and
N.T. Wright has made a similar point that the Gospels kind of don't get as much attention as they should get.
No, they're amazing, and
I
like that LDS people tend to prefer them more. So anyway, the thing about the Nephi is that the lessons of these mistakes are very valuable, and the real way that a person progresses in a personal life, and the way that civilizations and even businesses and sports teams and other groups is, you don't get a book of instructions that says here's all the correct things to do. You get a book of instructions that says here's some guidelines, here's some of the things to do, here's some of the things not to do. I can't tell you everything, and that's a great verse that Benjamin says. Like, I can't tell you everything. Like, you just got to watch yourself,
Right.
And the Book of Mormon is an excellent reference list, and that's just really how philosophy progresses, science progresses, morality progresses. As we say, it took humanity a few thousand or a few hundred years, but now we know that this is a really stupid thing to do. The
Right.
Things A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J are all dumb. They seemed like great ideas at the time, and they can seem tempting again even now. But the Book of Mormon is just like an excellent case study of like, no, seriously, don't do any of this crap. And then it makes the argument that to go by faith is you're going to make mistakes, and you're just going to have to add to that list of things not to do. And most people who are religious, and especially critics of religion, say it should be about a to-do list, and it's about dogma. Almost all religions are, especially Western ones, are quite dogmatic, and I think that's wrong. I think that when Jesus was on the cross and he said, my God, like when he's like, I hope I don't have to drink this cup, that he was thinking it was still a possibility. And then when he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? I think with him, the true mortal experience was for him to say, oh my gosh, I'm going to die alone and in a horrible way, which is what happens to everybody. And that was necessary for him to have the human experience. And I remember talking with our friend Aaron, and he just hated the fact that Mormonism jives so well with agnosticism, which to me is a sort of humility. And I don't believe in a pure agnosticism, but I really like the agnostic bent that Mormonism has. And I think that it ties in very well with faith and humility and in following Christ's footsteps, because he himself didn't know, like, till the end. He's like, oh my gosh, this is the end. This is my mission. I thought it was going to be something else. He wasn't putting on a show. He wasn't saying it for the sake of other people. He really was like, I can't believe it. I can't believe this is it. This sucks. Oh my gosh. I mean, I'm going to do it, but this sucks.
Yeah.
I can't believe this. And then he died.
Right.
And if that's what happened to him, how dare we mortals try to claim the kind of authority that has been claimed so many times in history? And any time that happens, it has been horrible and disastrous.
What the authority or the pretense to perfection, or
like an overreach, to use a shallow example, like how the Catholics hated on Galileo. Well, no, we already know the thing, and anyone who says otherwise is a huge jerk, and I'm going to hate on you, and Inquisition, and it's not. And I mean, I don't have anything particular against Catholics. I'm just saying that that's an example everyone knows.
Sure.
But there's a version of that in almost every religion. There's an LDS version of it. There's but institutionally, that's just kind of it. It's like, oh, we must cleanse the. There's a hilarious joke by a stand-up comic where he says, where he's like, well, I'm a Baptist, and then he asks this guy like 12 questions, and he's like, which kind of Baptist are you? And then he's like, do you agree on this? He's like, and which when there was this split, and there was like 10 splits that no one knows about, and then he's like, so and are you 1895 or 1903 or something like that? And the guy's like, 1895. He's like, I was 1903. So then I said, sir, I need to discuss something to you, and then I pushed him off of a cliff. like they agreed on everything, and at the very last second, there was something to disagree on. So he pushed him off a cliff, and it's very very funny, the delivery, and there's just this temptation to do that, to say I got the answers now, and the LDS religion. Something that scholars and people who compare different religions to each other will point out is the ninth article of faith is fascinating, because traditional Christianity just does not allow for change, and same with Islam and Judaism. It's like there's some flexibility, but there's also things set in stone. The LDS Church is the only one that says, nah, pretty much anything's fair game upon acquiring further knowledge.
Right.
That comports itself with science and humility and faith, and the experience that Jesus had and taught, I think, better than anything else. Yeah,
that's an interesting. That's an idea that fascinates me. Is that I see that as kind of like one of the big moments in religious history that Mormonism contributed to, is that concept. Not that the concept had never occurred to anyone, but I guess embracing it as a religious principle. Right. And that's a big deal.
And you have, and so what we have to back that up is the Book of Mormon, because the Bible is great, and there are people making mistakes. And Jack Miles shows that very subtly, especially the Hebrew Bible makes this case too, that we talked about, right? But that's something that only comes upon multiple rereadings, and most people are going to miss it. You know what I mean? Like I didn't catch that. Like God is a character developing and changing throughout the course of the Hebrew Bible, and that the way the Jews ordered it was way cooler than the way the Christians order it. You know, but the Book of Mormon is just like, well, here, this is how things have been done for a long time, and here's how it worked out for yet another group. Well, and the Mulekites and the Jaredites.
Yes, multiple examples of failure.
And here's the one thing I wanted to share with you that I thought you would get a kick out of.
Okay.
Before moving on to Jacob is, so remember how we talked about the spider that's going to get you no matter what?
Yes.
And civilization will inevitably collapse. There is kind of a solution to that, and that is if you try to do a reset button and you be prepared to extricate yourself, like crazy wilderness survivalists, go form your own little colony type thing. That happens like 4 times in the Book of Mormon. It's at the beginning. Nephi and Lehi do it. It happens in Omni, which no one remembers, but it says there was a complete destruction of the Nephites except for this one group, and then we started over. And then it happened with the Mulekites. They were the last remnant of a group. And then there was a version of it in Ether with the Jaredites. So it keeps happening over and over again. And if I ever have to do a talk about food storage, I'm gonna talk about hackers and crazy wilderness survival type people, and be like, look, this isn't just some dry topic. This is actually very, very in line with the Book of Mormon and how God's used civilizations, and because eventually it might even be you, will have to pull a Lehi or or the Mulekites type thing and get out of Dodge so that the human race can still survive.
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting line of thought that could follow from that is because I've wondered lately if there is kind of there's a compromise of values that comes with full participation in any civilization.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that's been noticed a lot through history. Jesus certainly pointed out, Henry David Thoreau talked about it, and that whether it's a full withdrawal, like some type of monastic withdrawal or that.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to get right.
But yeah, I mean, it seems like it's hard to live authentically. Let's take the example of Lehi. Like, Lehi really couldn't have lived according to his values and the knowledge that he had in Jerusalem. He just couldn't do it. It wouldn't have been allowed in the society that he was in. And so he had to leave. That's an extreme case, but maybe if there were a less extreme case, maybe at least he couldn't have been a great leader in that society, or he couldn't have moved up the social ladder and had high esteem in his society. Right? He would have been, to some degree, an outsider.
And this is the thing Nephi really struggles with. He tries to make it, he spends a lot of effort trying to say, look, I'm a revelatory guy, and I tried to bring, to get to new ideas. And that's because that's what he should have done. But I think that you could really make the case that he himself was too traditional. In some ways he wasn't, but it's even the way in which he wanted to be a rogue upstart was he just compared himself to Joseph. He's just like, I'm just like Joseph. And it's like, you're going to rehash that, dude. Seriously. And obviously, and I think Hardy does a great job showing that Lehi does not agree. And I mean, just the fact that, that Nephi had this sort of idea and he'd said it to his brothers. And so, Lehi had to have heard about it. Like Laman and Lemuel would have told, like, Dad, did you hear this crap Nephi is saying, right? And then what does Lehi do? He names the two of the next boys Jacob, which means supplanter, who's even younger than Nephi. And then he has Joseph, and he's like, oh, you think you're so great because you're the youngest? Okay, great. Now you're not the youngest anymore. And I've named them Jacob and Joseph. Now what? Like, I mean, that's just kind of a smackdown. And then we don't see the fact that there is no blessing that Lehi leaves to Nephi in 2nd Nephi chapter 1. That is so significant. Yeah. Like, there's absolutely no way that does not have a ton of significance, or the fact that we don't have Lehi's interpretation of of Nephi's killing of Laban. We never hear what Lehi thinks.
Right.
And he probably, I think Nephi thought he had to do it, but Lehi probably didn't. He was like, well, I didn't say that you had to do it, but he's like, Nephi, I know you'll do what it takes to get it back. And Nephi's like, okay, I did what it takes, and I did what it takes, Dad. And Lehi's probably like, I didn't mean that kind of thing is what it takes. Like, no, this isn't, he should have had the faith to, and then Hardy says, Moroni Christianized the Jaredites, which is just showing that you can have different kinds of dispensations. Mm-hmm. Nephi should have written new scripture rather than say we absolutely have to have the brass plates. And I think he realized that afterward, and how bitter of a realization would that be to think I really didn't have to do what I did to get the plates, or maybe I didn't even have to do it at all. God would have provided some other thing. We should have, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah. This sounds very speculative, but there's more in the book that suggests towards it. I won't get too crazy, but there's one other thing I would like to add about Nephi, that if you think that Hardy's account is not good enough to showing that all was not well between Nephi and Lehi, Jacob is not talked about by Hardy, but the relationship between Jacob and Nephi is also quite tense. and I will just go through some of those briefly.
Yeah, please do.
So, first off, the first easiest, lowest hanging fruit, it might not seem like it, but the first one is that you have to remember that when Jacob gets these plates, Nephi is practically dead. So you get this thing, and some of it is going to be lots of Nephi's opinions, and then it's like, hey, Jacob, what's your opinion? And Jacob's like, are you serious, bro? And one of the things that Nephi says is, we lived after the manner of happiness, which I've always found a curious phrase. Like, we did what happy people do, but we weren't really happy. Is that what he mean? Or does he mean that they were actually happy? And anyway, what is Jacob's last verse long after Nephi is dead? I will read it. I won't quote too many verses directly, but this is so good. I conclude this record, starting in the middle, declaring I have written according to the best of my knowledge by saying that the time passed away with us, and also our lives passed away like as it were unto us a dream. We, being a lonesome and a solemn people, wanderers, cast out from Jerusalem, born in tribulation in the wilderness, and hated of our brethren, which caused wars and contentions, wherefore we did mourn out our days.
We mourn out our days, yeah.
Yeah. He does not sound like a happy guy. And he's dying an unhappy man, Jacob is. Jacob followed in the steps that Lehi told him to and that Nephi wanted him to, and he was a priest. And in the end, he was still bitter and angry and sad. But what did Nephi write that Lehi, and remember, this he had to have taken some liberties in telling this story because it was decades ago. But when he talks about Lehi's speech to Jacob, it says, Jacob, I know that you're sad, but there's a reason that we're sad. And there's opposition in all things. Right. And that's like a rebuke from Nephi to Jacob. Really?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Because 2 Nephi chapter 2 is directed to Jacob. And then he includes, and then he says, look at this speech that you did, bro, when you quoted Isaiah. And there's a lot of there's a huge speech by Jacob that's like 6 chapters long, where he reads Isaiah a couple, and he's like, how can you say that you're still so sad? But here's the other thing. There's this church video of Jacob talking to the people, and I can't stand it. I know that they need to make it sanitized, but think about what really happened when Jacob burst in to condemn polygamy and the seeking of riches. Nephi was dead. We don't know who. It is so embarrassing that Jacob won't even say the king's name. It's the only time in the Book of Mormon where there's a king mentioned, and on the Nephite side, and we don't say the name of the leader. King Noah gets a name. Right.
He's mentioned by name. And every single leader, Mormon covers every single one. Right? But Jacob can't even, Jacob is so ashamed that he doesn't even say who it is. And the only thing it could be is it's like a nephew, or it's like Sam, because Sam's name disappears. Right? And then, so at this point, Jacob is a weird position. He's literally the only person who could rebuke this king, because remember, it says that the king was super highly, it was basically like Egyptian style or Mayan style. Like they viewed him as practically a god, right? Like the way that Nephite kings were revered. So for Jacob to go in, and it says, I got my errand from the Lord, but obviously, so he didn't get up to a podium and give an out speech. He just went in there and ranted at them. Yeah. If you read carefully, that's what he does. And he got away with it because he was literally the only person who could, because he was Nephi's brother. He was older than the king, and he was the priest. Anybody else would have tried to do that. They probably would have been killed. You know what I mean? Yeah, or just or exiled, or no one takes you seriously. But Jacob goes in there and he condemns polygamy, and he condemns that. And where did the polygamy come from? It was either Nephi's idea or the next king's idea. That's how quickly things have gone.
Really fast, yeah.
That's how quickly things went to pot after Nephi got in charge with his little colony. How horrible. And we also know that Nephi had a lot to do with it, because in Mosiah, when Zenith, it says, so in Alma, Mormon drops that he says that the naming convention is the first person to possess the land is who it's named after, right?
Right.
So Zeniff wanted to possess the land of Nephi because that's the place Nephi went when he first bailed on everyone. So it's a special land to them because it's where he went, but the Lamanites had it. So then they finally get it. And then once they do, what does Noah do? He starts practicing polygamy and the seeking of riches. They're trying to relive the old, crappy, racist glory days.
Interesting.
Yeah, and when Abinadi preaches against him, Abinadi, of course, is highly revered by the person reading the Book of Mormon and by Mormon himself and by Alma. But when he starts speaking against the king, everyone grabs him and says, "Look at this loser. What have you done, great king?" The people loved King Noah. Everyone thinks that he was so horrible, but he was really more like that guy in the Book of Ether who the people love, who he was very kind to the people, but he didn't do justice to himself because of his many whoredoms, blah, blah, blah. I don't remember his name, but you know that king, right? He was like that.
Yes. But yes, King Noah was quite revered by his people.
And King Noah's mistake, and King, there's Grant Hardy says many times Mormon tries to say something miraculous is the reason, but really it was a commonplace stuff, like when the people of Ammon got destroyed because of Alma's preaching, not because of Ammoniah got destroyed because of Ammon's preaching, not because, it was God's judgment. That's just how it happened to turn out. And then Mormon says it's God's judgment, but you could easily say it's because of a regular thing. Well, it's the same thing for Noah. Noah was a coward. He was overcorrecting for his father Zeniff. Zeniff was overzealous and fought a lot, and Noah was trying to keep the peace. And when, and he was afraid of what Abinadi said, and then everyone said, he has reviled the king. And he's like, oh crap, I better kill him to save my people. Noah probably thought he was doing the right thing when he killed Abinadi, actually.
And it does sound like Noah was somewhat hesitant about it as well.
Yeah, he was. He says he was afraid of what Abinadi said. He's like, oh crap, this is kind of true. And then he's a horrible military commander because he was conflict averse. He was trying to and that's just the thing. It's like, it's a great example of, you could say, like, even the idea that dogma A is bad and we must fight against it can become a kind of dogma. Zeniff had his problem because he kept doing his thing over and over again, and he cops to it, right? He's like, I shouldn't have been so gung-ho, and I got a bunch of people killed. I feel crappy about that.
Yeah.
But I really wanted the land of Nephi. It was important to us, Right. And then Noah was like, well, I tried to not do what my dad did. But if even that can be a tragic thing, right? Like, I will not repeat the mistakes of my father. Great. You didn't repeat the mistakes of your father, and you got yourself killed.
Right, yeah.
Instead of getting everyone else killed, you let a bunch of people get killed because of failure to act, which, from neglect. He's like, there's a part where it says, the Lamanites came in, and so Noah sent some people and he beat them back. And they're like, yay, we're the best. And then there's a time when he sent troops and he didn't send enough. And they got their butts kicked. And he was a crappy military leader.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that. I guess I'd always considered Noah to be quite an effective or valiant military leader, but not necessarily based on any text. It's just an impression I had. But
no, there's nothing in there.
It might have been a counter reaction too, as well, to the portrayal of him as kind of a pathetic slob.
I think that's being hammed up a little bit. Though, I mean, there is probably a relationship between being drunk a lot and having a lot of sex and then being a crappy military leader, right? But that's, that's something that Mormon put a lot of effort on because that's what he knew. That was his specialty. So he stuck with what he knew. And
and it's interesting.
A guy who was a crappy military leader.
The kind of religious disputes that occur in the Book of Mormon seem to be a little bit more sectarian than we might imagine. Like, we might think of it as like it's Christians versus atheists, where it seems to be more like a Christ believing contingent of the religion versus a non-Christ believing contingent.
Yeah, it seems more similar to how religion was during Roman times or during the Middle Ages, right? Like, if you were Catholic or a Protestant or a Huguenot or whatever, like it wasn't just your belief, it was like who you were, right? It was practically like your race.
Yeah.
And I think that's how it was for the Nephites and the Lamanites. And that's why it was so dramatic when anyone would change and they would say, yeah, they decided they would take upon them the name of someone else. Like that is a huge, that's like basic. That's not just like saying, I'm not going to be LDS, I'm going to be Catholic. It's like, I am not an American Mormon. I am now a Polish Catholic.
Yeah.
Like that would be the more equivalent thing.
Right. Well, and also, so like with King Noah's priests, they're quoting Isaiah to him, and they're having this religious dispute in the context of Scripture. So it's not a complete, like, we just have completely different views about the nature of God.
I think that when they're quoting Isaiah, that Abinadi tries to say, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about." Well, I'll tell you. Obviously, the priests think they know what they're talking about. They were saying it rhetorically. They thought they were reenacting Isaiah's vision of awesomeness, which is what Nephi thought he was doing.
Right. Well, so that's an interesting one, and I've wondered, and I think I have an idea. I'm curious to hear your thought on this. But so this is in Mosiah chapter 12, and they quote from Isaiah chapter 52. And when I was reading this, I was wondering, okay, why would they quote that verse? What was the significance of it?
I wondered that for a long time. Yeah.
And and my takeaway was that Abinadi comes in and he's bringing bad tidings. He's kind of like Gandalf the Grey, right? He's coming in and he's telling people that they're doing things wrong and that they're going to be destroyed. And then they quote this passage from Isaiah saying, "How beautiful upon the mountain are the feet of him that bringeth good tidings," which seems like the exact opposite of what Abinadi is doing. Like it's some type of rebuke, like there's setting him up to be like, okay, how is he gonna respond to this when he's acting in a way that's completely contrary to the way Isaiah describes a messenger.
I just thought of something. Mormons trying to make Abinadi look like Lehi or Jeremiah, who were also very unpopular because they were preaching doom and gloom, and everyone was like, "What are you talking about? It's about the opposite of that, dude."
Right.
And so they're having it's that same argument.
Yeah. Do you think that makes sense that they would have been thinking that? Or what was your thought?
No, I know that's what I'm saying. I agree. They say they're like, how beautiful about blah blah blah. He's like, so if you don't think this is what, because at the time during that conversation, nobody, not even Alma, believes Abinadi. Things are going great.
Right.
The people have the king that they want. They have beautiful temples. That's another thing. Nephi built the temple with precious stones, right? Noah rebuilt the temple, just like in the Old Testament, the idea of getting the temple back. Yeah, we're doing it. We're doing what God wants us to do because God never changes his mind about anything.
Getting the band back together.
Yeah. Yes. Getting the band back together. Yeah. And so, and the Lamanites haven't started kicking their asses yet or anything. They're not swarming in there. They're not doing anything. Nothing bad has happened to them yet. So they're like, how are you saying this to us when God has blessed us so much?
Right.
It'd be like if you were in a ward and that ward or the church as a whole was prospering. They had the money. Everyone was getting what they wanted. Therefore, how can we say that
having
God
great super activities with lots of trips to Lake Powell and
and everyone has their recommend and everyone and we're building lots of temples and everything's going great. Every objective.
I loved my super activity to Lake Powell, by the way.
yes. By every measure, by the KPIs, by the numbers, we're doing so
right.
great.
Right. Yeah.
100% ministering is going on up in Abinadi. How can you say this word needs to repent? Right. Yeah. So. Yeah, I think that's what they're. I think that's where they're going with that. Yeah.
And what's interesting too is that I think Abinadi brilliantly responds and.
Oh yes,
and he has a very good point in his interpretations of Isaiah as well. Is that so that's Isaiah 52, right? And then in Isaiah 53, it has a very different message about the way a servant of the Lord is going to live. And it's Christologically interpreted by Christians, I think, legitimately as describing Christ. This is he is despised and rejected of men. And I think that's a fair interpretation. But another interpretation, and probably the original interpretation, is that this is describing the kind of life that a servant of the Lord can expect to live, is that he's going to be somebody who's despised.
I've read multiple places that that's clearly proof texted, but I mean, Paul texted.
It is proof texted.
Yeah, and Paul proof texted. Yeah, Jesus and Paul proof texted. So saying, "Oh, your proof texting is not a criticism anyone cares about."
Exactly. Yeah. No, it definitely is proof texting, but I think it also, well, in a way, Abinadi does point this as speaking of Christ. But you could also think of it as he's also talking about himself, right? Because they've said, okay, you're coming, you're bringing bad tidings, but Isaiah said that a servant should bring good tidings. And he said, well, guess what else Isaiah said about a servant is that they're going to be despised and rejected of man, acquainted with grief. Everyone's going to hate them. They'll be esteemed. They won't be esteemed by men. So that seems like a brilliant rebuke as well in response.
Yeah, and Hardy said, Abinadi is being set up by Mormon to be comparable to Moses, when he quotes the Ten Commandments back at them. But I think you're right. Yeah, he is also comparing himself to the Messiah and to Isaiah, and it's just, it's a brilliant tactic. It's like, oh, you Isaiah, you want to quote Isaiah? Okay, well, guess what? There's some dark and scary parts of Isaiah too, and how are you going to ignore that part? And then the other thing is, he says is, so what exactly does God want someone to do to bring about that kingdom? And they're like, well, do the law of Moses. He's like, okay, well, you're not living the law of Moses.
Right.
Are you? Are you? And how are you going to bring about that kingdom when you're not living the law of Moses?
Yeah. Now I'm going to do something.
And sometimes the wicked sometimes the wicked prosper, dude.
Yep.
So how do you know? So are you seriously going to say because you're prospering that you're good? That's so dumb. Of course, the whole thing is very political. The trial is very public, and it's of a kangaroo court, and the only thing the priests and Noah care about is not the theology. It's about keeping order with the people and making sure everyone's in happy land. And the polls say that 97% of people approve of King Noah, and we're gonna go do great against the Lamanites. Rah rah rah. Don't want to keep the morale good, right? But the thing is if you just do the same things over and over again, you're going to get yourself vulnerable. You're going to get yourself destroyed, which is where they were headed, even if it's only for practical reasons. Noah was a crappy commander and not spiritual ones, though I think you can make a case that both of those things are important.
Are related,
So Abinadi tries to go in there, and everyone's like, no, this guy's going to ruin everything. We got to kill this guy. Oh, crap. We're just going to have to. And they were trying to treat him the way Sherem was treated, or Korihor or Nehor was treated, right? Only, and that's Hardy says parallel narratives, and he doesn't compare them this way, but I think it's a great comparison. There's people who say, I think, Korihor and Nehor, like, you guys are bad kings, and you are bad kings, and everything's going to go to pot because of you. And then, but those were the bad guys.
Right.
Whereas Abinadi is like, you guys are bad kings, but he was the good guy this time.
Right.
So that's stuff like that. I thought that part of Hardy's book, there's a line he says where, he'll commend people of the very different types, and you can have very different personalities who accomplish God's will. Like when he compares Captain Moroni and Helaman number 2, right? Mm-hmm. With his stripling warriors. It's like completely different stories, but they both accomplish God's will. And yet dogma doesn't really allow for that. So Mormon, and so like I said at the beginning, Mormon is making a great case against dogma very subtly, and he doesn't act like it. He acts like he's dogmatic too. So that anyone is willing to read it and it's accessible. But then you read it 10 times and you're like, wait a minute, there's some tricky stuff going on.
Are you meaning there that in arguing against dogma that he's showing that there are different things that work in different cases? And it's not always the same.
The answer is usually it depends. And it's just crazy that even that is an example of the idea of a prophet preaching against the king or the chief judge or whomever. In one situation, the chief judge is the good guy, and the guy who is claiming to call repentance is making the argument in bad faith. And then there's other times where the king is the wrong one and the prophet is right. Though I think and sometimes in real life, honestly, they're both bad or they're both good or they're both mixed. But easy, widely distributed, lowest common denominator religion doesn't teach that. It's like, well, it's just like, no, the king's always bad and the prophet's always good. Even that idea is open to dispute.
Right.
I think. And Abinadi is an excellent just microcosm of what the whole Book of Mormon is about and the story of it. Like he's very comparable to Lehi. He dies like as a martyr. Mm-hmm. In the end, there's some king who dies. There's a fight between the Lamanites and the Nephites. The Lamanites are shown, the Nephites are shown that they are not all they're cracked up to be, and the Lamanites are shown that they're not all as bad as we thought that they were, because the other thing is that I wanted to say about the polygamy thing before I forget is there's a part in Mosiah where so originally there was this tacit agreement that women and children don't get killed, and we do it the old British way. All the men will go and agree to fight somewhere, and whoever wins, right? Uh-huh. And there will be some sort of Geneva Conventions of sorts in place. Mm-hmm. After the priests of Noah mix with the Lamanites and teach them their language and teach them the Nephites' way, the Lamanites start objectifying their women also. And the women and the children start dying in wars.
Yeah.
But it's not until after that has occurred.
Yeah. Well, and it's explicitly mentioned as a cultural difference, right, by Jacob, that there's a much different treatment of the Lamanites and their attitudes towards their wives. And
but I'm saying that's further evidence that he was telling the truth about that.
Right. Yeah.
Even hundreds of years later, when they're trying to relive the old glory days, it's all about the polygamy with the Nephites, and the Lamanites and the Lamanites eventually buy into it, and it's awful. And one thing that people criticize the Book of Mormon for is there's no women in it, and so it's anti-woman. And I'm like, it's a book about what not to do. So they're gonna I see. And so it's like, right. There's all these men who are like, we did things wrong, and then they don't quote women because they don't know how, and they never kept any records of what women said, really.
Yeah.
And so that's an example of what not to do, and the Bible doesn't make that mistake, fortunately. But
that's an interesting point, yeah.
But the Book of Mormon, I mean, you criticize it for having no women, and it's like, well, the Book of Mormon isn't a book about what to do; it's a book about what not to do. So in a really weird way, it does preach for, in favor of women in a strong way, because the way that they end up treating women in their society is just awful, and that's one of the reasons for their downfall.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I can see the logic too of the idea of polygamy and greatness going hand in hand, because that's kind of like worldly and material success.
That's existed in many different cultures. Yeah. Or in many different spots around the globe. That's been equated with, we're awesome.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Now, I was thinking I could make a very Mormon type comment here. Is you look at all of this detail and think, there's no way Joseph Smith could have come up with that, but and that's such a Mormon thing to say. But I mean, you, I can't necessarily disagree. um,
I don't think. Yeah, I think that there's never been any good theories about how he made it up.
Yeah.
Every single one that has come up has been really dumb and pretty much disproved. And even
Right.
on the Exmo Reddit, there's a guy who's like, I've spent 5 years on Spalding and it's just not true. Sorry, guys.
Yeah.
And the only thing I can think of, and that there's no evidence for it, is no one ever talks about Hiram. And Hiram was pretty sharp, it sounds like. And so if there was some big scam type of thing, I would think maybe Hiram helped.
That's where it would be. Yeah.
But that's 100%. That's 100% speculation. I've never even heard an Exmo say that, and there's no evidence for it. Yeah. The only thing that could have happened was that he and a group of people wrote it beforehand, and then when he did the whole cloth thing, saying he was reading from plates, he dictated something that they all wrote. But even there, it is still a masterwork.
Yeah.
Even if he wrote all of it or part of it, or it was a group of people, it's amazing. And I mean, the Bible, the Bible, they say, was probably the book of Genesis, or the Pentateuch was likely written by just some random woman. I've heard, and each book was just written by some person. That's the curious thing about it. The Hebrew Bible is the books are just there and no one takes any credit. Like they attribute a name to it, but no one knows who wrote it.
Right.
And yet it's still amazing, and people look at it and they say, this is from God. So then
just by virtue of the text itself.
Yeah. And then the New Testament has names attached, and then we don't, it's assumed that Luke wrote it, but we don't even know that's why that's again why Paul is so great, because we know Paul actually wrote those. That's a real person with a consistent and sizable body of work. But with the Gospels, it's like John didn't write that, Matthew didn't write that, Mark didn't. Mark was probably written at Peter's instruction and guidance, but not actually written by Peter.
Yeah, Paul's kind of the exception for having such a very.
And that's why he's so attached to. But the rest of the New Testament is great and better, in my opinion. And yet, there's no this notion of authorship being valid or true didn't matter. Like, it was just the notion back then was, we have no idea how to prove who wrote it. It doesn't matter who wrote it. The question is this text from God? Is this a great text? And so Joseph Smith really plays around with that cleverly, just to be like, well, I got the plates from God, and it's about ancient civilization. It was written by a bunch of other people other than me. It's very Don Quixote, as it's very quixotic, right? As Hardy pointed out, and I think that the church and thing where it says, does this really, a lot of times when they say, does this matter? I think, well, yeah, it kind of does. But on this one, I am inclined to agree. Actually, no, it does matter a lot less than people think. I'm open to it having been some sort of man-made product, but to me, even if it is that, it is inspired. It is an amazing book,
right? I mean, in a way, like I think, and Grant Hardy, and he had a podcast once where he did say, I do think historicity is important, and I can see that, but in a way, it's also kind of like maybe an important, but one of the least important or interesting things about it. Like, there's so much more beyond that. It's almost like just take it for granted, and then
I mean, and it doesn't. And when it comes to, and it's like, even, so it's like Paul says that Jesus rose from the dead and that he spoke to him, and Paul is a real person. That this is something that all historians agree on.
Yeah.
And of the 13 epistles he wrote, 2 of them are debatable, 5 of them weren't his, but there's like 6 or 7 that are definitely, I can't remember what exactly.
Yeah, pretty undisputed.
That it's undisputed. Those were written by the same dude. And yet that's not like proof that Jesus rose from the dead or that there's a God.
Right.
In the end, that no one says, well, look, here's Paul. Don't you believe in God? Like that never works. And so,
Yeah.
Mormon follows that logic, and Nephi kind of follows that logic, and then Grant Hardy pays special attention and says Moroni
definitely does.
He has this realization that it's like, it doesn't really matter what we saw or what we say we saw. It doesn't really matter if I have the proof. What matters is this right? Is there a God? Do you feel him? Do you think that he is telling that the things I am saying are something that God agrees with?
Yeah.
This is the real question that you need to answer.
And
it can be answered more than one way. And that's the thing. And we take it for granted, but like Moroni's promise, like there's nothing really like it elsewhere in religion. Like most of the time, because of the political backing or its own history or the laurels, no one needs to go around and say, oh well, you should seek to God and see which one is true. Like that it's very American, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's also very egalitarian, and it's very personal, and it's very I don't know how to put it. It's very fair. It's very reasonable. It's very one thing that someone has pointed out is something that annoys me is when people says, well, if I if God, an angel appeared to me, I would just think that someone was playing a trick or that I was on drugs or something like that. And everyone has a different little standard of what it would take to prove to them that they believed in God. And it's interesting. Some people say, well, someone prophesied something 100% perfectly, I would believe that they were from God. And other people are like, well, I would have to witness this thing. It's very interesting that people have different standards for that. But the thing is that the people who wrote the New Testament were not idiots, and Greek philosophy was already well underway at that time, and it's addressed kind of it's addressed not in a Mormon style way. Hey, you guys, I wanted to talk to you about this thing, and here's my argument against it. But they just say something that they just instead say it, and it's in Luke where Jesus is walking with them and he eats the fish. So now let's say you have an angel that comes by and you're like, I don't believe you're an angel. And the angel's like, yeah, okay. He walks over to your plate where your food is. And he's like, this is so good. And he takes a bite of it. Can you imagine him trolling you with that? And he picks up a fork and eats some of your dinner. And he's like, yeah, I guess I'm not real. And then he disappears. And then the plate of the food is still there. Now what do you say?
Right.
And so that story in Luke is kind of there to there are people who've said that at the end of Matthew, there's the part about the soldiers were lying and stuff. That was put in there to address anti-Christian literature where those two Roman soldiers said that. And I feel like that bit with Jesus eating the fish in Luke is there to put aside any silly notions of, okay, you want to talk about whether it's real or not, let's remove all the excuses and get down to the real thing. I'm telling you, this guy is as real. Whatever your standard for reality is, this guy met it. I saw him. Yeah. Blah. And Moroni kind of does that thing too. He's like, okay, I get it. There's a bunch of stuff we can equivocate about. There's tons of reasons you have to doubt. There's tons of things that religious leaders can get wrong. But at the end of the day, we still have to decide on something together. Mm-hmm. And are we going to be on the same team, and are we going to get along, or are we going to be like this stupid civilization civilizations that destroy themselves? Because that's what's going to happen if you're not careful. Yeah. So if we have to be careful, then what? And so Moroni puts something forth, and he does so. What he says is quite reasonable, and how even I went to Australia on my mission, and that's about as unfriendly as a place to religion as you can get, of places where you are allowed to preach. Obviously you could say China is less friendly or the Middle East is less friendly, but of the developed world, You know, like, I mean, there are parts of Europe that you would get better reception
Interesting. Okay.
than Australia. You know what I mean? Like, they don't like to talk about politics or religion. They are a very not religious place. Most of the people who are religious that are there are, you know, they're very, they pay it lip service, and they're very open about that. They're like, oh, there's a phrase I learned there called hatches, matches, and dispatches. That's the only reason I go to church. I'll only go to church for hatches, matches, and dispatches, right? Like when a baby's born, mean? Hatches as in babies getting baptized, matches equals marriages, and dispatches equals funerals. It's a very Australian thing to say, right?
Oh, that's funny.
Even for them, when we got to a point in the discussions where we're like, well, here's the book, and you know, it's between you and God now, and we talk about Moroni's promise, they'd always like calm down, because Australians, even more than Americans, do not like to be made fools or manipulated, and they value their independence, you know. And they're suspicious of authority and institutions, in just in a different way, like, you know, and they are, and you can joke about the fact that they're descended from prison colonists, but they don't think it's funny. It's that, like, they might joke about it, but deep down it is actually a sensitive topic for them. Totally different than how America was founded, right? And so you'd say that to them, and they'd be like, oh, that's a really gentle ask, you know, like they're like, and they never ended up getting an answer from God, or even following through on it, but they never really got offended at the question. They always thought like, oh, that's really not, you know, that's a really mellow ask. I mean, yeah, we would ask him to get baptized in the second discussion during those part, and that part they hated. Yeah. But the first part were like, well, you know, it's between you and God, you know, but you got to figure it out. They would always soften at that. Most of it, they're like, this is absolutely ridiculous. I can't believe it. And they also are distrustful of Americans in general, and don't like being bullied by them, stuff like that. kind of like how people feel about the U.S. in general, but they're even more sensitive about it because their country is not too powerful, and their prime minister just does whatever the U.S. says. So like, oh, you're coming over here to tell us what to do with your American religion, you know. But then you'd say that, and then they would, if you were able to get to that part, that part was the least likely to get any criticism, less than the first vision, less than the Book of Mormon itself, less than, you know, the church laws and requirements. They just hear that, they go, oh, okay, you know. Never made anybody mad. It's the gentlest. It's an extended hand of, you know, let's work something out. There's an Islamic, a Sufi mystic, Ravi, I think his name was, and he said somewhere out there, somewhere away from all of the civilization and where all these old arguments are, there's a field with no one in it, and I'll meet you there. And I think that is, I think LDS religion is, and its people are, you know, for various reasons, are kind of better at doing that approach. And the Book of Mormon itself, and here's the other thing, people say, oh, church culture, and they don't realize, and it's like, a lot of church culture actually does come from what the Book of Mormon teaches. And that whole, you know, like, for example, the way people are very timid when they say, well, to me, the interpretation means this in Sunday school, right? It's very, you know, trying to avoid spirit of contention, kind of thing, and trying to avoid dogma and bullying. And Joseph Smith taught that, but the Book of Mormon itself, and there's tons of things that Joseph Smith said explicitly about that, but the Book of Mormon itself really says that, you know. I think that is pretty characteristic of my way of thinking as well. So I see myself in that very much. I agree. So
I was thinking we've talked about some of the I guess less flattering sides that we don't always pay attention to with some of these people in the Book of Mormon, particularly Nephi. Um, and but in a way, it's in a way that adds to the complexity and the Joseph Smith couldn't come up with it type of quality of it. And people can get defensive about that, and I that's understandable that you're attacking Nephi. I mean, Nephi is the best, but it reminds me
of. Isn't that true of real life though? The really famous "I'm so great" guys end up taking up all the air and the space, and then they're kind of fraudulent. And who takes up the most space? Nephi and Alma the Younger. And they're like the two worst. Who are the awesome ones though? There's Abish, there's Abinadi, and there's Ammon, the missionary Ammon, and and Captain Moroni too. He gets a bunch of credit too, and he's kind of meh. But those, there are awesome people in the Book of Mormon.
Yes,
and one of or there's the Nephi and Lehi that convert, that are the only ones to get Nephite apostates to come back.
Yeah, because that's usually not a very successful endeavor.
Yeah, and there's probably Pahoran too. He's such a humble guy. He's like
Pahoran. I love Pahoran.
Yeah, you're very Pahoran, aren't you? You're like, it's okay. You meant well. You didn't mean it about me so much as about the thing you thought I was doing.
Yeah.
He's
all good.
Or Laconius. No one remembers who that is. That dude's a freaking legend. So there are a lot of great people. And it's funny. There are, like I said, there are examples of what to do, but the people who take up all the space, and how relevant is that even more in the last 5 years? The people who are doing all the talking and taking up all the space, and yes, that is a dig against Trump, but even on the liberal progressive side, there are people who are loud and sensational. And that the other liberals are like, oh, why did they get all the attention? Because they're being the most annoying and the loudest and the most sensational and controversial. And it's like, how do we deal with that? And it was a problem for the Nephites too.
So you were asking me before, like, am I convinced of this type of interpretation, the kind of Hardy interpretation? And I was kind of saying, like, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily like I'm holding that above all others. I'm kind of like, the guy in Sunday school, like, here's one way of looking at it without wanting to offend anyone.
It is a valid way.
Yeah, a valid way. But I think it's interesting how there are two ways. There are different anxieties that people have toward the Book of Mormon. Well, a lot of anxieties that people have about it, in wanting to defend it, or concerns about ways that it could be attacked. So I mentioned Thomas Wayment, and Michael Austin kind of had the same approach, where Michael Austin in Buried Treasures talked about how he was worried that when he would read the Book of Mormon, that it wouldn't measure up, that it would be too simple. Yeah, I think he was worried that the Book of Mormon would be what most people want it to be, right? Because there's when we hear our heroes being attacked, we get defensive, and we're like, I guess a more theologically conservative response is to be defensive, where on a more theologically liberal side, we're more like relieved when we find these character flaws, right? It's like, oh, wow, the Book of Mormon has a lot more depth and complexity than I realized. These guys aren't perfect. how wonderful. It's like the opposite response. But I guess there's a little bit of, depending on what you're looking for, there's something there for everybody. But I just find it entertaining how those complexities that that you find in the Book of Mormon that just make it not even so much for historicity, though it do that too, but just showing the richness and the depth of the book as a religious text. People see it in different ways, and I guess I kind of identify a little bit more with the theologically liberal side, where I'm like, Oh, wow. Seeing that Nephi was a person with his own motivations and interests that he was driving at. Well, first
Hmm.
of all, in the historicity is like he wasn't Joseph Smith; he was his own guy. But then also just as a literary and theological approach to Nephi, it makes it a lot more interesting because then it's like,
Hmm.
well, you don't always have to take Nephi at face value. You can take the first layer of what he says up front, and then be like, okay, but how might what Nephi is saying also not be completely adequate, and in what ways did it fail, or in what ways was it different or cause conflict with other narrators or prophets in the Book of Mormon, and it just opens up a lot more depth in the book, and in a way that can be kind of um, a relief, but it definitely brings people into conflict, like we see with Hardy and Boyce, right?
Hmm.
Uh, that they're wanting different things from the book,
Well, and
and
that's sad to me because, like I said, I think the Book of Mormon fills a gap in that is very unique in Scripture. Most Scripture at the world level, it's either like poetry or it's like a raw, pure revelation like Isaiah or the Quran, or it is stories with an anonymous author. The thing is that in real life, the people who are talking to you are never anonymous. It's always, hey, I'm Todd Decker, and here's something I'd like to share with you today. That's real life. And the Book of Mormon is finally a scripture that has, hi, my name's Nephi. Here's what I have to say about some stuff. And the thing is once you do that, and everyone has to do that, everyone has to stand accountable for the judgment bar of God, and anyone who wants to discuss religion with anyone else has to make some sort of assumption, and yet we're also supposed to avoid dogma. What the heck are you supposed to do with that? And Nephi's tension, where he knows he screwed up, but he also knows he needs to give you something to to be. He needs to give you some positive stuff and give you some faith. How in the world can you, a sinner, and this is the Christian dilemma? We believe Jesus redeems us, but do we really believe it? You know, and so are we really? Are we? There's two dilemmas. Are we really willing to listen to a sinner? Are we really willing to speak as a sinner? And yet, that's what we must do. We must be
mm,
willing to speak and listen to listen to and speak as sinners in God's eyes with each other, and to go forward. And the Book of Mormon talks about that so much more. There's the Waters of Mormon. There's Moroni talking, emphasizing at the end, that the church needed to gather. And there's tons and tons of obsessing over church operations. Like I said, Acts. There's not enough Acts in the Book of
mm.
Acts in the New Testament. There's tons of it in Alma and Mosiah, and kind of with Nephi. Only his is more intimate and family based.
Where they're trying
But
to figure out the logistics of how to live day-to-day
but
life.
it's a great and unfortunately women's voices are missing and marriage is missing, but we do have family relationships, and we have political public relationships, and then there's church drama and military drama and all these different things of conflict. And how do we live with ourselves? How do we live with each other? That's one of religion's biggest questions: is how are we supposed to treat each other and view each other in the eyes of God or the universe or whatever. And the Book of Mormon does that. And so it makes me really sad when they just like, no, Nephi's awesome, everyone's awesome. It's like, if you want that, then the Hindus covered that, and the Greeks. The Christianity, like Life of Pi points out, the great thing about Christianity is here's a God who cares about us. He's not above it. Like, he's powerful, but he's not
Right.
like so awesome that we don't think he would care about us, because the Hindu gods or the Greek gods, like they rarely concern themselves with us mortals, which can make you feel alone. It doesn't cover everything that you need. from your God, from religion. So
I need
Jesus
to read that
comes.
book, by the way, Life of Pi. Jared mentioned it in our Lord of the Rings pod.
I think you'd like it. It's a pretty simple and easy read, and it's a parable, and it hits on religion. And at the beginning, there's a kid who has an experience with clergy of sorts that are Muslim and Christian and Hindu. Well, he's in India, and he covers Christianity last. And one of my favorite parts at the beginning is he's like, the Hindu, he's like, this God, he's like, so here's all awesome Hindu gods. Here's Allah, who's so awesome that he doesn't need any help. And then you have this guy, he comes down to earth and he dies. What a wuss, right? And he doesn't get it at first. And then, like a light bulb clicks on and is like, this is a God who relates to us. This is a God who cares. That's part of Christianity's appeal.
Right.
And so when we treat Book of Mormon figures on these pedestals, even though they repeatedly say, I can't understand how you would just automatically assume that Nephi's hand-wringing over his own mistakes and anger is just him being humble. I think it's quite clear he's sincere. It's quite clear that he has regret.
Right.
So even by Nephi's own words, we should say, okay, here's a guy who made mistakes. What can we learn from those mistakes? And same with, in church and in Doctrine and Covenants and Joseph Smith, Joseph Smith had a revelation from God to him, rebuking him for losing the pages because he let Martin Harris have them. He just and Joseph Smith / God or God were like, let's put this in the Doctrine and Covenants in the Book of Commandments for the entire church to see how its own founder, well, Christ is supposed to be the founder, but its own first prophet screwed up. And so the concern is a valid concern, but I don't think it should defray us. And again, Mormon 931, Mormon says, judge may not, my father for what he has done, but, and so he's saying, don't obsess over don't condemn us, but also it's also not to say, but also don't deny what we said or did, because you need to learn from it. That's what you should do with it. When someone makes a mistake, you don't say, oh, I love you, I will completely forget about it and not use anything from it. It's, oh, I love you, what can I learn from your stupidity? Okay, let's move on,
Yeah.
Like when you're parenting, there's your kids will make it's fascinating to see how much of them is already built in their genetics, and it's like, wow, I can see that they will be a pain in the butt in this way for their entire lives, even when they're old. And it's like, oh, that's how my parents see me, right? And it's like, that's just how we view each other. And the Book of Mormon is a great covers that, and the other books and the Bible just doesn't. There are interesting characters in it, but they are not fleshed out in the same way. They're the apostles, and Paul. We don't know them the way we know these people in the Book of Mormon. Especially Mormon himself. Oh my gosh, so much to learn about this guy, right? The Mormon and Nephi and Moroni, like the three. There's especially the first two, so much. So in depth of a character study you can make. And there's so much gold there. Like you said, it's not the only way to read the Book of Mormon, but it is a great approach. I think it's indispensable. I think it's one of the core ones. You should read it to focus on Christ, and then you should read it to focus on the people and their relationship to Christ.
So we kind of skipped over the main framing of Hardy's argument, but maybe we should give that in case it hasn't been. But the general framing or thesis for Hardy is that he's giving a narrative study of the Book of Mormon, and looking at the way the narrators crafted their texts and what their interests were, and the big three are Nephi, Mormon, and Moroni.
He says the most discussions of the Book of Mormon are about Joseph Smith, and did he make it up or not?
Uh-huh.
And it's like, why can't we just say it doesn't matter whether they made it up or not, and look at the characters on their own merits as if it were a novel. And then if we did that, so we assume that the person, you can assume that the person is real or not, but even if you think it's made up, people still study literature and speculate about the actual characters. And he quotes some academics who say, yes, there's lots of interesting things you can learn about a work by speculating about that character, even though it's not a real person. So even if you don't think they're real, it's still interesting to do that. Obviously he doesn't, but he's like, you can still, this is a place where we can both meet to discuss it. And I think it's a very interesting discussion, and I think it's a great argument. It's a great argument he ends the book on that note. Like, he admits that he's defensive about how there's a ton of stuff at the beginning where you can tell he's very upset. He quotes the Catholic. He quotes someone who says the Book of Mormon is like the only book where it doesn't matter if you've read it or not to have an opinion on it. And everyone just dismisses it, and it's okay to dismiss it. And he is like, this is not a book to be dismissed. And this is a great book. And he talks about it, and at the end, about how there was a gracious, I think it was a Protestant professor who read through Alma 36, and he's like, this is very pretty. You guys are lucky to have such a great text in your religion, which was generous words, but it's true. Alma 36 is awesome.
It is.
In Book of Mormon is awesome.
Something I was thinking about it in the Book of Mormon generally, in its kind of makeup, is one is, why is it sometimes dismissed, and then how does that relate to the beauty of it? So I think you have those beautiful parts, and Alma chapter 36 is very structured and intricate. There are parts where the language is more choppy and not as skillful.
Mm-hmm.
But that's also kind of like, I almost think of that as a feature rather than a bug.
I think so too. Yeah.
Because Robert Alter recently came out with a translation of the Hebrew Bible, and one of his translation strategies, it's just not unique to him, but is basically to try and kind of recreate the flavor of the Hebrew in an English translation. And I was thinking, because we have the Book of Mormon in English, and there are official like LDS translations into other languages, and then there are also other denominations that have translated, and they have different translation strategies. I've read it. The language I've read it in most is Spanish, because of my mission in Paraguay, and it's a very I don't feel like it necessarily reflects the flavor of the English, but it'd be interesting to try and do that. Like, I'm not even sure how you would do it, especially if you were to go back and go to the original manuscripts that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were working on. It would seem to have a lot more halting parts and awkwardness, but Robert Alter also tried to do that with the Hebrew, right? Where some parts, King James English, which is wonderful, it has these ornate expressions of the Hebrew text, where he tried to reflect some of the, I guess, more rustic side of things, and with the idea in mind that this is part of its character. This is part of what makes it what it is. And I could kind of see that maybe that's why somebody like Mark Twain would consider it chloroform in print, looking at it, but you could look at it in another way as like, this book has character. It's not a polished gem with a perfect sphere. It has features.
I mean, we have a very pretty book already, and that's called the Bible. Mm-hmm. To me, I agree with the we don't need any more Bible verse means we don't need any more scripture. I agree with that. I like Nephi, I disagree with that. But the sentence "we don't need any more Bible," as in literally we don't need more Bible, is true. The Hebrew Bible, I guess the New Testament we could use more of, but the Hebrew Bible is like a complete work, man. It's got so much, and it covers a lot, and for what it's doing, I don't think it needs any backup.
Mhm.
It's like there needs to be. To me, the Book of Mormon is an incredibly Christian text, because it is a book that reaches out to you. So like I said before, the Hindu gods and Allah compared to Jesus coming down humbly and simply dying, it's someone that we could relate to. The Book of Mormon is like that version is like Jesus, but in book form. It's like these guys that we can relate to. The New Testament and Old Testament are great, but it's not trying to speak to a particular group of people or speaking as an individual person. It's just like, here's the account of Jesus, and it's very poetic, and it's very beautiful, and it's very intimidating, and it's especially Hebrew part, like it's very smart. It's a very smart.
The Book of Hebrews.
Yeah, no, I mean like the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew people. Yeah. The Bible is a very much a smart person's book, but Jesus wants to be accessible to everyone, and I think the Book of Mormon is. I mean, I wish it were not as awkward, and it doesn't need to have it came to pass so much, and it could definitely be better written, but it's not there to be that. It's there to be like your pal, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's to be like, instead of being like, there's different kinds of preachers, and there's some who are very polished and they have their PhD, and they have and they publish a bunch of books, and they're so respected and everyone loves their books and blah blah blah. But there's also that the rogue, the street preacher with the jeans on, who can keep it real and knows how to reach the person that other people can't, because he is a man of the people. The Book of Mormon is more like that.
That's an interesting point. I mean,
and it's written by guys who tried the first approach, and they're like, yeah, we kept trying to be fancy pants, and that backfired. It wasn't a one size fits all approach. Sometimes you just need to get your hands dirty.
Yeah.
And so Mormon includes a lot of those stories. He says Alma decided not to be the chief judge anymore, and he decided to dedicate himself to preaching. And then he also talks a lot about Nephi, the third one, in the Book of Helaman, who did the same thing. And then there's Ammon, and his brothers. They decided to give up their inheritance as royalty and go be humble missionaries, which is very similar to Joseph Smith and the early LDS missionaries, like when they went to England. It was a different approach. It wasn't, here's my fancy church. Here's my fancy, not that I don't think there's a place for it, but it's kind of hinted at, like with the Rameumptom and the Church of the Devil. Like, I'm so great, just listen to me. That's not what Jesus taught. And the Book of Mormon, it's not just that it says, hey, let's be humble. It walks the walk.
It is humble.
Yes, it is humble. You can tell, Nephi and Moroni are quite obvious about their anxieties as writers. And Jacob too. All of them are. The only person who isn't is Mormon himself, which is very interesting. But if you read between the lines, you can tell he's got a lot of trembling too. And there's a part where Hardy points out, he says, Mormon just keeps quoting other people a ton. And then finally he starts to get a little more bold with Third Nephi. And he's like, you know what? I am a prophet too. I don't know. Like I've after all this warming up, it's true. I am one too. And then you realized he really was one all along. He just lost his
because there wasn't
mojo.
really an indication of that before. He was more like a compiler, and it's like, okay,
and Moroni's insertion of Moroni 7, which is the only pure sermon of Mormon himself in the Book of Mormon, is one of the best chapters. And it's you can tell that the Mormon who is writing the Book of Mormon is not the same Mormon that gave that sermon. The Mormon who gave that sermon in Moroni 7 is filled with hope, and you can tell he thinks that the Nephites have a chance. He tries to pretend that they never did. They always did, but he gave up, or or he made a mistake and they were going to fail anyway. But he makes it sound like a foregone conclusion. That's one reason he really likes putting the plates of Nephite in there, because Nephi knew it was gonna. He's like, oh, Nephi, it's Nephi's fault.
Yeah.
Nephi knew we were going to be destroyed the whole time. I feel better. Right? No, but he didn't think that the whole time. He acts like it, but he didn't. And Moroni puts that there to say, look, to very subtly show, look, my dad got discouraged, but he still put out some amazing stuff, and you can still learn from him.
I like how you mentioned that the Book of Mormon gives us something that we don't see in other scriptures, which is the narrator's voice. So because there's
and relationship between narrators, like Mormon and Moroni and Nephi and Jacob. Those are people related to each other. Yeah. There's and you can tell they're related and that they're family, but they're still distinct individuals. There's nothing like that in the Bible.
Correct. Yeah. So what I was thinking is, in a way, it's kind of an opportunity to see, because there's in study of the Old Testament, there's redaction criticism, which is basically trying to understand the people who were taking the pieces and putting them together. What were their motivations? But what we lack, it has to be detective work, right? Because there's no text where they're saying, here's me, I'm putting this together, and I know it's for this purpose, right? There's no account of that. Where Mormon, you get that, right? Not completely. Like Hardy still kind of reads between the lines, even for Mormon. But with Mormon, you do get like, this is me. I'm writing this book. Here's when I'm doing it. Here's why I'm doing it. So in terms of redaction criticism, it's kind of a great opportunity to see, like, here's one example of a guy who was doing this and how he was thinking. And in the Hebrew Bible, you get little things here and there where it's just like in Genesis, they'll say, oh, and back in these days, there were Canaanites in the land, or this is why this is called this now. But
very brief, though.
Very brief. But yeah, with Mormon, you get something much more expansive, and you know his name and when he lived and that type of thing. Mormon, is after reading Hardy's book, Mormon fascinates me even more now. I would love to, maybe at a future time in discussion, we could get into more like your insights on what Mormon was like based on reading in between the lines of his redaction.
Mormon is the one that's the hardest to unpack of everyone. And there's tons to dig up about the other three, about Nephi, Jacob, and Moroni, and about characters that they write that Mormon writes about. But Mormon says the least about himself, but we also have the most written by him. And my opinion is that he gave up. He spins it as it's the Nephites' fault, but if you look at the way he constructs his excuses, plus with what Moroni said, is he made a mistake somewhere. It's highly implied that he gave up. I also think, and it would take a long time to make this case, but I think that when he mentions that he was a pure descendant of Nephi, and his father carried him into Zarahemla, and then he writes to the king of the Lamanites, this is where we're going to do battle. Mormon was the king. He just says, I was the general, but the king often was the general also. He was like the god king.
And he was quite young, so that would kind of make sense too.
I think it was a coronation.
Right.
He says, my father carried me into the land, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
This sounds very, very speculative, I acknowledge. But there's, I can make a good case for it, but it would take quite some time. It's not as heavy-handed or obvious as the other things I've said. But I do think That's the thing. I think he was literally. Oh, the other thing that is highly suggestive is that, in the Jaredites, they just you keep fighting until one of the kings dies, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what happened with Mormon, and they kept fighting because Mormon was the king, and he didn't die. Yeah, that's and I kind of wonder, is one of the reasons why Mormon wanted to include the Jaredites in there was so that you could subtly see how he was like Coriantumr. He could see himself becoming like Coriantumr, and then Moroni says, "Yeah, I was going to write about the secret combinations that the Jaredites had, but the Nephites have all of those, and so does modern nations. So why do I need to get into that?" But he's being coy. The secret combination, and Mormon's like, well, Satan puts it into their heart. They don't need to get it. But it's highly suggested, again, that the Jaredite plates give the secret combination idea. Oh, yeah, I forgot to say, secret combinations, sorry for this, but this is awesome. Secret combinations don't come into the Nephites until Shiblon loses the plates. And Alma says to him,
"Okay,
don't lose these. They're serious, and bad things can happen if you lose them." He loses them, and then it's like there's the secret combinations. So Mormon himself might have gotten the idea. Mormon and the Lamanites. Well, I think the idea was there before he was coronated, but he went along with it. And then he's like, wait a minute, why do I have to honor the sacred traditions? The sacred traditions are sometimes stupid or outlive their usefulness. But I just followed along with it, and now look what happened. We're dead. I thought God was on my side. Nope.
Yeah.
How dark. How sad.
Yeah.
So maybe we should do that. We can talk about just Mormon in a few months.
Yeah, I think that would be very interesting. I think I'll have to reread the whole Book of Mormon. I could do it with that in mind. By the way, what the strategy of like reading the whole Book of Mormon with one focus? Mm-hmm. I've usually heard it like underlining Christ or references to Christ. I haven't heard many others, but like have you heard of other focuses that people have had, or have you done it?
You can do one about how much it tries to honor and reference the Old Testament.
Oh, and have you seen people do that?
I don't know of anything formal about it, but
that would be a very interesting one.
But there's tons of individual pieces. There's David Bockavoy, I think, kind of does that. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of stuff in Interpreter to say, look, this is, and in Hardy's book too, that says, look, this is how it's trying to compare itself to, the scriptures that came before it.
Yeah.
Abinadi is a Moses. There's a million.
Right.
But you could pretty much, that could cover the entire thing. Another one would be, one reading that I did after reading Hardy's book, I totally did a read through, and I think this is what Michael Austin kind of did through. I totally did a, what's that term called? Oh, I did an unreliable narrator read through. I seriously did like twice and said, I am going to not believe a single thing that any of these guys say about the history at first. And I will just doubt every single thing. And it's really fascinating what kind of conclusions you come to about it. And you'll probably see new things of that regard. Another one might be...
I love that because... there's something like I love things with like inner levels, because in order to do that, you basically have to kind of take the historicity for granted or bracket it, right? Because in order for them to be unreliable narrators, they have to be narrators in the first place.
Yes.
Which is kind of cool. I like that. How on one level it's sort of unfaithful, and on another level it's acknowledging a faithful position.
Another way you can read it all the way through is as an argument against the as a theological treatise within its own time frame, like how much of it addresses Protestant ideas.
Yeah.
I mean, some of it agrees a lot. Sometimes it's like, yes, we 100% agree with this Protestant idea, and other times like, nope, this one is 100% abominable. You could almost like literally every single thing. Another one is the relationship between Nephites and Lamanites and purity and Israel, and then also like God's holy people. That's the thing Michael Austin says, the mistake of thinking you're the only chosen ones, which the Bible, to its credit, speaks it quite, especially the New Testament, speaks quite strongly against that idea. But the Book of Mormon has new angles on that. Just kind of like the whole idea, like the kingdom, the fruit, the kingdom of God can be taken from you and given to someone else. So don't get a big head. That's like John the Baptist, right?
Yeah.
And then relating that to the church, like the Book of Mormon itself talks about the latter modern day church a lot. So just having it be what it has to say about Joseph Smith and the church, or what the church should be like, is in there a lot. Another reading you can do is about a political reading. Every single person except Moroni, notably, but that just makes it more interesting. Even Nephi, though Nephi mentions it's important, but it's not his primary concern, but he always leaves it in. And it's always Mormon's primary concern. But there is so much politics, and almost all of the points of view are from people who led the people. It's almost all of the documents and statements are either from people who were like the king or the chief judge or a former chief judge or whatever, right?
Right.
And what their struggle was to save their people. So leadership and what it's like to be the leader of a people. That's a good read through. I've definitely done that one, because like all of it is like, oh my gosh, how am I supposed to be a good person and not screw up and be the it's so stressful to be the president, right?
Right.
So stressful to be the king. Especially Mormon. It's just like so many decisions made by people who are in charge. And the intrigue. Let's see what else. Slightly similar to that, I would include it in the last. Is like is that survivalist? It's not cyberpunk post-apocalyptic kind of reading of it. No, seriously, there's so much of that in there, and the sneakiness. I like how Austin says there's a lot of people sneaking out at night. That's I did one reading where I compared it to the Miles point of view, where even though the Book of Mormon is very plain and upfront with you, it speaks a lot about sneaky things happening, like Tian can sneak us out and kills Amalickiah, and there's the records sneak out of Shiblon's hands. The account of Zoram, the account of Nephi killing Zoram was a secret, and then it got out, and that's why the Zoramites got so mad. The proof of that is in Amoron's statement, where he says, "I am a descendant of Zoram, whom your fathers pressed into service and took out, threatened, like you bullied my ancestors into coming with you, and yet Zoram chose to go with. Zoram chose to go with Nephi when the split happened, so he had to have gotten along with him at some level, probably."
The sneakiness is an interesting one to me, because it's something that I've been noticing, like like Joseph Smith's comments about craftiness and the sealing power potentially arriving out of a craftiness is interesting, and then also Jesus's comments about being harmless as dove and wise as a serpent. So there's a lot of ideas that I find.
Or Paul the Apostle, when he's like, this is a really ham-handed one, but when he's on trial and It's the Sadducees. He learns it's the Sadducees. He's like, who's prosecuting?
Oh,
Is
yeah.
it the Sadducees? Oh, and there are Pharisees here. He's like, hey, the Sadducees are giving me a crap because of this. And then the two people are like, oh no,
They fight with each other.
Yeah, and then they fight with each other because they're like, oh no, now we can't easily condemn him because then we'll lose our own political points.
That's right. We'd be giving in to the Sadducees if we, yeah.
It's totally naked playing games, but he's just trying to live, you know.
Yep.
Stuff like that.
Those are fantastic. And, you know, it reminds me how I was making a list of all the things that I have not yet read on the Book of Mormon. There's just a lot, you know, a lot of work that has been done on the Book of Mormon, and I think that's a testimony also to how much you can pull out of it, and from all sorts of directions, right? And with different perspectives as well. And so for example, social justice or progressive readings of the Book of Mormon are definitely available, right? And I could see resistance to that, certainly. But I think
did
that
one of those once, I made a list of every single thing that goes against prosperity gospel and says take care of the poor. Don't just choose to yourself, but like the people as not. It's not just you shouldn't force people to take care of them. That's the churches and individuals' jobs, not the government. No, it says the government should be doing it, like tons of times.
Interesting.
Especially Moroni. He's like, well, the reason things were so bad is that the people were split and the poor people oppressed the rich people oppressed the poor people. He's like, the number of times that is said, a lot of people I think it's said like 3 or 4 times. No, it is said.
It's over and over again. Yeah, it's all over the place.
I couldn't believe it. And some of the passages are like super nakedly progressive. I think the best one is where in 3rd Nephi it says, well, some people had chances for learning, and so because they had the chance for learning from birth, they got educated and they moved up in the world, and the other people had no chance, which totally goes against the pull yourself up by your bootstraps,
right,
you know, idea. And that it's crazy to me because that's one of the few common political arguments in the church where I think the Book of Mormon, like, you can't. It 100% is just like, no, this is how you should view it.
Yeah. I mean, well, and you know, there's a bit of like, with all the different directions you could come at. I mean, this is maybe a little bit of a furtive or tricky Tiankum like strategy, but I mean, it all contributes to a testimony of the scriptural power and richness of the book, that you can get all of this stuff from it, whether you agree with it or not, or maybe even especially if you don't agree with it. It's like, this is not like that there could be this much in a book, even for as long as it is. I mean, it's a long book, but that all that is jam-packed into there and you can pull all of that out of it. What a testimony of this book as a work of scripture. Even if you think the interpretation is complete bogus, just the fact that interpretation was possible, you know, is powerful. So I'm almost like, just like, come at it from all angles. I mean, let's see what this baby can do. As an example, a couple examples. Well, Hugh Nibley, obviously, he certainly had the historicity interest, of course, but also what I think you could call a social justice reading of the Book of Mormon, also the Old Testament, certainly, but also of the Book of Mormon and Approaching Zion. Lot to pull out there. One I haven't read yet, but looks kind of interesting, is a book called The Book of Mormon for the Least of These, which has 2 authors, Fatima Sella and Margaret Olson Hemming, which is basically, you know, a social justice reading of the Book of Mormon. So that looks kind of interesting. And there's definitely also the Maxwell Institute has tons and tons of stuff on the Book of Mormon, both when it was Farms, which had, it kind of is known more for its historicity focus, but also had a lot of theological stuff in it. He Nibley wrote for Farms, of course. And then a lot of the stuff they're doing recently, I have a lot of it on Audible, actually. But there's a series called Brief Theological Introduction Series. So they have like a book on each book of the Book of Mormon. So like First Nephi, Second Nephi, Mosiah, all those. So these are folks like Terrell Givens, Rawson Welch, Adam Miller, Joseph Spencer. Each take a book, and I haven't gotten into them yet, but they look very interesting. And that's just to name a few examples, but there's tons and tons of work on the Book of Mormon that could take a lifetime of inexhaustibility, right? As Neil A. Maxwell would say, the inexhaustible gospel, inexhaustible Book of Mormon. There's a lot there to pull out.
I agree with that. Yeah, I have one last reading interpretation thing to suggest, and then I don't think I can think of any more. But
please, yeah.
And I'm repeating myself, but a reading where you judge whether the person is being humble versus being dogmatic and overzealous. And okay. I think literally every character and every story, you have one or both of those things going on.
For any individual, you could see both of those.
No, I mean for any individual, at least one of those things is happening.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Yeah.
I think Nephi is the most interesting, but then you have, King Benjamin is humble, and Mosiah is humble, and Limhi is humble, but Zeniff wasn't, and Noah wasn't. Alma wasn't, and then realized that he should be. Same with Ammon, but they took a different approach. Captain Moroni, right? Versus Pahoran is, like I said, that super obvious one.
Yeah.
Book of Helaman, oh, so much pride. That's the darkest book. The Helaman and Third Nephi are the kind of the darkest in a way. Well, I mean, technically Mormon's time is supposed to be the worst, but like right. he tries to spare us from that. Whereas the details of the intrigues and stuff,
there's an interesting
Third Nephi and Helaman is just oof.
Hardy comments about how I believe it's in Moroni when Mormon is writing to Moroni, and so you're seeing just this isn't Mormon's what he's planning anyone else to see. He's just writing it for Moroni.
Yeah,
he gets a lot more graphic.
He's let his hair down.
Yeah. I mean, he that's where he talks about the rape and the cannibalism and all of that stuff, which probably was going on throughout, but. Maybe, but it may have happened in many times in the warfare. But
he seems to suggest the cannibalism part is new. And then I think the rape thing, like I said, that the priests of Noah is when that starts to get out of hand, and the idea gets introduced amongst the people. Oh, that's another reading is. Suppressing information to the public, suppressing information to the public versus not suppressing it. Mm-hmm. That is talked about so much. Like, therefore we instructed the people this. Therefore we said make sure that people don't find out this. Like the whole idea of what should the government lie to their people about versus what not, over and over again. And Nephi obsesses over it, right?
Yeah.
And then Jacob says, I'm not going to lie about anything. I'm just going to say a few things that I'm telling the truth about and let you read between the lines, right? And then Enos is just like, I don't know what I'm doing here, but this is what I think, and then you can see that already in his day, they've got a propaganda machine about saying the Lamanites are the absolute worstest, when we know that that's not true. Every story that Mormon has was a documented story, and how did he get that story, and why was it documented the way it was, and who was it shared with? That gets glossed over, but over and over the relationship between the private stories, the public stories, the ones that are in between, again, fascinating. Relates to politics and PR, and Jesus' comment on parables, where he's like, "Well, I speak in parables as a mercy, so that the people who
right,
the people who can handle it will hear it, and those that can't don't." I think the Book of Mormon inadvertently does that too. They're trying to do the same thing Jesus does with parables, only instead of talking about fiction, they're just talking about facts.
Yeah,
and that's the thing I have a strong testimony of that took me a very long time to figure out, and the Book of Mormon really struggles
of what specifically?
With this. I'm about to get to it.
Okay,
the idea that there are merciful and cruel truths, and there are merciful and cruel lies.
Oh, okay.
Even that, that used to be one of my few dogmatic things when I was in my 20s, and then I just kind of realized, I don't know, I don't believe that. There's people lie all the time for good and bad reasons, and people tell the truth all the time for good and bad reasons.
And so in your 20s, was it like you always have to tell the truth?
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm
seems like a very 20s type of thing.
Yeah. Were you like that in your 20s?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. But I mean, I certainly. Yeah, I mean, I always try and when it comes to like the parabolic expression as Jesus teaches in parables, not lies, right? We don't call them lies. But I have a greater appreciation for it now.
Yeah, I used to think that like the ultimate goal was have both people get to a point where they trust each other and can just both say what they think.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, as long as you can do that, that will solve anything. And I've now come to the conclusion that if you can do that, great, but that is not a one-size-fits-all approach to relationships with people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and this is getting a little bit out of topic, but this is what Scripture does, right? Can branch into different ideas. The nature of truths that we construct versus taking as a given. I've been toying with this idea recently, like, what's the real self? What is our real nature? And I think there's a strong tendency in society right now to see like your true self is what is most deep inside your mind in your gut natural reaction, right? So like if somebody says something that if somebody has a gaffe, right, or says, oh, that's what they really think, right? It's your unprocessed self. Or if you get drunk and say something like, and then later you try to say, oh, I didn't mean it. It's like, no, you really meant that. That's, you were showing your true colors then.
The id.
Where I kind of think, I don't really think that's a good way to look at it. I would more tend to think like the true self is what we are working on developing and building, right? Yes. There's no reason to prioritize what's deepest inside us and what's most natural and just a gut reaction. But part of the construction is building a truth, a new truth, and that's what I'm a little bit more interested in, is who is a person? Well, what are you trying to be? That's kind of what I would want to see, is like, what is this person? But
that's totally a valid Book of Mormon reading too. Yes. How are we going to define ourselves, and why, and what makes a person who they are, and why? The racism elements that come up in the Book of Mormon, right? It kind of touches on that, and then just construct the constructed idea of versus what's inherited,
right.
Dispensations. I think the Book of Mormon has a lot more interesting things to say about dispensations than the Bible does. The Bible has some things to say, but the Book of Mormon has more. I mean, like Jacob 5, the Jaredites versus how the Nephites saw the Jaredites, and how the Jaredites should be viewed. When the fact that I think Grant Hardy's most impressive thing is his discovery that Moroni totally makes up, like basically the Jaredites were not Christians, and Moroni fools us into thinking that they were. I think that was such an impressive find, and I don't think I would have ever found that by myself.
That is, yeah. And in a way, it kind of makes sense in retrospect, right? Because they're like,
once he explains it, you're like, yeah, he's right.
They're not Israelites, right? They're a Mesopotamian society that would have, I mean, I don't know, would they have been like Sumerians or something? We don't really know, but
Tower of Babel's approximately that, yeah.
But so they're not Israelites. They're come from a completely different society. Who knows what type of differences they had in their culture and beliefs. But yeah, that's quite interesting.
And the funny thing about that is it begs the question of, is Joseph Smith, when he translates this record, were the Nephites really Christians? Or were they something completely different, but for the sake of Joseph Smith's audience, he Christianizes their record?
Yeah. Well, that's another level, right? Because the hand of Joseph Smith in all of this.
Yeah, so some of the things the Nephites and Lamanites do were similar, not 100%, but there's a lot of stuff in there that is kind of like the ancient Americans. And were they really Hebrew/Christian people, or
right, yeah,
or is it just that the only way that Joseph Smith could tell us about those people was to translate their experience into a Christian one?
Yeah.
Whereas modern day scripture now, if God were to say, I'm going to make another Book of Mormon that is similar in style to the Book of Mormon, but is a completely different book, he could say, there's this people and they were a completely different religion, and here's their story. You could get away with that now.
Yeah.
But not during Joseph Smith's time.
Yeah. Well, and there's of course the well, I don't know how well known it is, but statement by, I was going to say well known, but statement by Brigham Young about how if the Book of Mormon were retranslated again, it would be a different, look different. So this is from the Journal of Discourses, and this is Brigham Young talking here. He says, should the Lord Almighty send an angel to rewrite the Bible, it would in many places be very different from what it now is. And I will even venture to say that if the Book of Mormon were now to be rewritten, in many instances, it would materially differ from the present translation, according as people are willing to receive the things of God, so the heavens send forth their blessings.
I've never heard that. That's interesting.
You haven't? So the nature of some of the theological disputes, what made me think of it, you were talking about, okay, some of it does seem to be like maybe some of Joseph Smith as an additional narrator on top, bringing in some of his views and the ideas that were alive at the time. But an interesting thing that does seem to have some type of ancient 600 BC type of ideas is an interpretation that Lehi and his family were in one contingent in a theological battle at the time in light of the reforms of Josiah in Israel at the time, or the kingdom of Judah. That and the basic background of that was that the theory being, well, not so much a theory. We know from the Hebrew Bible that the worship of the Lord, YHWH, Jehovah, was often mixed with many other deities. And in the Hebrew Bible that we have, it's roundly condemned. But obviously it happened, and people believed in all of these gods at once, right? So people would believe that the Lord had a consort named Asherah, or that there were other gods. Baal, for example, could have been a relation to, or El, several other Canaanite gods, right, mixed in with all of this. And one interpretation of Josiah in the book of Deuteronomy is that they kind of cleaned house, said, okay, we're only going to have this one God that we are going to acknowledge. And one interpretation of that is that Lehi was resisting that a little bit, because wait, hold on. There's also Christ, because Christ is against this strict monotheism. There's a kind of either Trinitarianism or I hesitate to say tritheism, but that it's not as simple as just one God, one person, but Christ is in the picture as well. And what is always resisting, Lehi comes and he talks to the people about their sins, yes, but he also talks about that Christ is going to come, and okay, they threaten his life. Throughout the Book of Mormon, you have these antichrists. A lot of them say, like Sherem, for example, was all good on the law of Moses, but he wasn't in favor of Christ. It almost seems like Laman and Lemuel, there's a part where they say the people of Jerusalem, Lehi misjudged them. They were good people. They worshiped a God. They followed the law of Moses. They don't say it, but I wonder if maybe part of it was that it's just this Christ element that is that Lehi's insisting on, that is blasphemous or heretical, rather than Laman and Lemuel being complete non-believers, right? So it's interesting. I wonder if that was part of the one way that the Book of Mormon is a testimony of Christ. Not only that, or here's one last thought on that: the plain and precious truths that were lost. What were they? What one thought I've had is that it's specifically the Old Testament teachings that would have been more transparent about there being a Jesus-like Christ figure, right? Somebody who is actually divine and comes and dies.
Isn't that kind of touched on in the Book of Enoch? I'm trying to
remember. That's a good question. There might be.
So some of the books did. Some of the older books did.
Yeah, the non-canonical.
So some of the books that were found, I do think have some of the plain.
Yeah, and right, and now that you're mentioning it, the Dead Sea Scrolls have some talk about Melchizedek, who was more kind of a divine figure. Yeah. Prophets that are quoted in the Book of Mormon that are not known anywhere else. So like Noom, I'm not sure how you say that, but
Neum, Zenos,
who are very in the quotations from them, they are very explicit and clear, and Christological, right? But if we take the Book of Mormon at its word that those prophets were taken out of the text, that would be an example of a plain and precious truth, right? Regarding Christ specifically, that would have been removed. But anyway, that's a thought I've had about some of the theological controversies in the time.
Yeah, no, I agree on the Jesus thing. Every time Jesus gets brought up, people are like, "This is so weird. Why are you guys bringing this up?"
And it kind of would be, wouldn't it? I mean,
yeah, no, it's true, but it's not to the I mean, the Book of Mormon, it says, "Oh, this is another testament of Jesus Christ, and this is a book about Jesus." Then you go in there, and so you're not expecting, and there's lots of talk about it, but you can tell it's not discussed amongst people too often. Or when it does, it gets drowned out, such as when Abinadi does it. He quickly gets killed afterward. Or most of Nephi and Jacob's stuff, like it's them encouraging the people to live in a more advanced way. But it doesn't, it keeps having to be, Jesus has to keep I find it interesting in the Book of Mormon that Jesus keeps being brought up. And it's a new thing. Like the idea of him keeps dying out, and it's not able to take hold. Apparently, of course, obviously, my theory is that Nephite culture, and the premises of Nephite and Lamanite culture made it so that it didn't jive too well with that. So it was hard for Christianity of a sort to really take hold. And so in that manner, Nephi, he already, he thought he was following Jesus, but all the things that he did made it so that people wouldn't want to be, because again, like I've said, I don't think being a follower of Jesus is being dogmatic. And if you're dogmatic, it's a false version. It doesn't, you're not really acting like Jesus. It's more, you're acting like traditional, like old Judaism or old Islam.
Yeah, well, there's that aspect of like
anytime Christians want to be like, well, we're Christians and we're going to conquer everybody. I'm like, dude,
right.
like wrong religion.
Yep. Yeah. Right. Jesus is not the macho.
Like the other one, there's all the other guys specialize in that. Like you guys,
right. That role's taken. Yeah.
yeah.
You know what's interesting? In the when the missionaries from so in the Middle Ages, when missionaries were going up into the northern, like Scandinavian regions, Germanic areas, the weak or the suffering Christ was a bit of a hard sell, and so sometimes they would change the gospel narrative a little bit to make Jesus seem a little bit more like a warrior, and that he was more like when he was crucified, it was like, yeah, I'm gonna take this, try to inflict pain on me. I can take it like a man, They made him seem quite a bit more macho.
Sure.
But yeah, I see what you mean. Like, somebody who's conquering and in warfare and having lots of wives and showing how wealthy and strong he is and successful and worldly, that's not the Christian. That's not Christ as your God, right?
No.
That's a different thing.
Nope. No, that's the other that Nephi's pretty clear. I think that's the church of the devil that acts that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That it says the church of the devil seeks the money and the glory. That's the devil's way of thinking. So
right. Good. Well, any other
good on that bright note.
Yeah. Well, the book, it's a tragic book, right? So
no, it's like I said to my friend, the Book of Mormon is not a happy book. And
everybody dies,
honestly,
what are we gonna say?
And anyone who's like, I need comfort from God, I would say don't read the Book of Mormon.
They all die at the end. There you go.
Yeah. And the writers are depressed. Nephi is so discouraged. And Jacob is depressed, and Enos and the other guys are like, whatever. And then Mormon is like, okay, like he's trying to, he does a good job of acting like he's holding it together, and he's so thorough and meticulous that you get lost in his own stories and you forget about Mormon himself.
Yeah.
Then you get to him and he's like, yeah, this is what happened with me, and anyway, I gotta go. And then you don't hear from him again.
Right.
And Moroni's like, my dad died. It's
yeah.
like, oh. And then he's like, and then he inserts stuff to say, and by the way, and by the way, this is what happened to my dad. But don't condemn him.
One other thought, I did remember one other thing. Because like we talked about kind of social justice issues, racial issues, and things like that. I think that's very interesting in light of your comments about how the book often shows what not to do, right? Because certainly there's a concern about the way that races are portrayed in the Book of Mormon, and what to make of that. Now, it's an interesting question of, why did God create people in different races? That's an interesting question, and maybe we're supposed to learn something from that. Another thing is, the unreliable narrator type of thing. When we see things like people with dark skin who are talked about in ways that are, just not, you shouldn't talk about people that way. Certainly not based on race or regardless, right? It's just horrible. You can also flip that around, right? Okay, here's an example of how not to talk about people or to people, and that we are supposed to be better than that. But it demands more of the reader to do that, right? To be able to.
I mean, it's kind of plain. If you, the thing is that there's just so many other bigger themes that take up so much more space. But if you do a reading of the book, skipping the parts that don't talk about that, there is plenty. And Jacob really, like you said, when he's like, the Lamanites treat their wives well, and you guys don't. Right. So why are we talking about how awesome we are? Then you get to his son Enos, and Enos doesn't feel that way. Enos is like, the Lamanites were horrible. And then after that, Jerem's like, yeah, the Lamanites are awful. And Grant Hardy already establishes that they're not, that Laman and Lemuel and Nephi, their fight was complicated and not so black and white. And then Mormon does a really good job of trying to say, you know, black and white, bond and free. That's a Nephi quote, but he goes out of his way to say, look at all these times that the Nephites were stupid jerks, and look at all these awesome things that the Lamanites sometimes did, like the anti-Nephi Lehis, or Ammon's conversion of Lamoni, or Samuel the Lamanite, who Jesus was like, how is this not in your record? You know, and then you can tell they struggled with it. It's just like the idea of Jesus itself. It's like, let's not be racist, and then everyone's like, yeah, let's not do it, and then it dies off.
It kind of happened. Yeah,
it just keeps dying off. All the good ideas, all the great things that preserve a civilization are hard to maintain, and it's hard to not get your civilization destroyed. You know, there's so many things that can go wrong. And King Ben, and the King Benjamin, you watch yourself. There's so many different things that can happen.
My daughter's been very interested, with Black History Month.
I remember you mentioning that.
Yeah, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and all this. I remember I had when I would read the Book of Mormon children's versions, I struggled with how to address Nephites and Lamanites, and because I don't want to say tell her that this was a result of God cursing people, but there are other. But I've been surprised when I've found other messages in the Book of Mormon that because there are different racial groups in the book, gives opportunities for anti-racist messages, right? That you can see people talked about the Lamanites this way, but really there were many good Lamanites, and that these stereotypes were wrong, or that they were, so a lot of Nephites thought that there could never be peace between the Nephites and the Lamanites, and just wrote them off. But Ammon didn't feel that way, and he went and he lived with the Lamanites and said, I'm in this for the long haul. I'll be here till the day I die. And he brought people together. And so there are a lot of messages there that are positive as well. So you have both the what not to do and also some good examples of what to do, not to have any ites among you and those type of things. So.
Yes.
So I've been pleased to just realize that.
Yeah, there's and there's a lot of there. Yeah, and that, like I said, there's a lot of Mormon really speaks against that strongly. He puts in tons of examples of the Nephites saying, "I'm so awesome," and the other guys are losers, and then eating crow for it. There's Noah. There's the Zoramites and Rameumptom. There's Amlici. There's the people of Ammonihah and the Order of Nehors. There's Amalickiah and the Zoramites trying to, just over and over and over again, these people saying, I'm so great and you're not. And then he's like, oh, yeah, well, it's like, well, let me tell you about all these. And it just keeps going against it. Oh, and then in Helaman, oh my gosh, so many times he's like, yeah, during this time, the Nephites were bad and the Lamanites were good. And there's a part where he says, in the church basically had no Nephites left, and they were almost all Lamanites. And then there's the parts, like you said, there are no manner of ites in 4th Nephi. And then the problems is when they start saying, let's adopt labels again.
Yeah. I have this image of like people complaining about Mormon being this liberal college professor being like, oh, you're just making the Lamanites look like they were always the good guys, and your revisionist history. And
yes.
But there does seem to be a little bit of that, right? Like,
Oh,
he
he's
does kind
very
of-
heavy-handed, but he's skilled because he makes
Yeah.
it look like he's neutral.
Right.
He's not. He's picked these same types of stories over and over and over again
Mhm.
of the Nephites falling on their face. And
Right.
why wouldn't he? Because his people are about to get destroyed, and
Yeah.
he's like, and he's probably thinking to himself, like, how did we get here? So then he goes
Yeah.
through and he's trying to present a narrative that will make sense, like, so that you can see, oh, this is why they were destroyed, right?
Right.
He doesn't want to, he wants to stay consistent with that. He feels bad that his people got destroyed. He's like, I don't want you guys to get destroyed like my people did.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
here's how we got there.
Yeah.
And then he's like, I was going to say some stuff about Nephi myself, but you've heard friendly from me. Here's a totally different spin. Plates of Nephi.
Mhm.
These are great. Let's stick those in there. Right.
Yeah.
And then Moroni's like, look, my dad did a lot of effort doing these logical arguments, and they can only get you so far. So I'm just going to ask you man to man, or man, person to person.
Mhm.
Just pray about it,
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Well, good. Well, Micah, this has been wonderful. I mean, I really want to go read the whole Book of Mormon now. I feel very motivated about it. I mean, I'm just the world that the world's ideas that this opens up is very inspiring. So,
good.
So thank you for joining me tonight. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, I've enjoyed it. We'll have to talk specifically more about Mormon again. And
I think that sounds great.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, have a good night.
See you.